Hello, it's Jason Renault with the Alternative Mobile Services Association and AMSA Talks. This week I'm with Jennifer Lee. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here.
Well, Jennifer is you're with Georgetown University and you have a fascinating project going with FIFA, the International Football Association. We're going to talk about that, but let me ask you first. Tell us a little bit about you and about your work at Georgetown.
Sure. So I am one of the two founding directors of the Center for Community Health Innovation, which is housed at the O'Neill Institute for National Global Public Health Law at Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C. I know that's a mouthful and there's several layers there, but I think in simple layman's terms, what I do is I work on social determinants of health. I'm a policy lawyer, and I work on issues as far-ranging as climate change and climate adaptation, workers' rights, housing, and community economic development. I think I take this approach from a movement lawyering or a community-centered lawyering perspective. That's how we tend to work with our partners on the ground or our clients, so to speak. I think, um, you know, it's interesting because I think this is at the intersection of a lot of my previous experience working on issues in criminal defense, on international human rights. And we can talk a little bit about the FIFA project, but that is where everything kind of comes to a head in this FIFA project for the World Cup in 2026.
So before people glaze over, let me tie this
Would
together
never, yeah.
and say, how does FIFA have to do with mobile services? And well, people may know or may not know that the World Cup is coming to the North America, to Mexico, Canada, the United States in 2026. And mobile crisis has a role to play in these, what, 16 cities?
16 host cities. Yep.
And just name a few of the cities so people know what we're talking about here.
Wow, this is a test. So the World Cup is happening in 16 host cities across Canada, US, and Mexico. In the US, the host cities include or are Seattle, the Bay Area, LA, Dallas and Houston, Kansas City, um, Atlanta, Miami, Philly, Boston, and New York, New Jersey.
Wow. Now, some of those have well-established teams. I'm thinking San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Atlanta, but some don't. So Kansas City, um, Houston has a team, but it's anyhow. What is the role of mobile crisis in the World Cup? We're not playing, are we?
Are we playing the World Cup?
We don't have to get on it in uniform and kick the ball.
I mean, you could. I think you just have to breach the barriers of the stadium first. And yeah, I think we're a baseball country, not a, or the other football country. We're not so much soccer people. But no, I think so. Maybe I can describe the context for this a little bit before I answer your question about why this is important for alternative mobile services groups on the ground. This is 104 matches that's going to be taking place simultaneously in the United States. 104 across 16 cities in three different countries translates to exactly 78 matches in the United States. That means a minimum of at least five matches in each city, each of the 11 cities, over a 6-week period.
There's a huge number of people coming in and out.
I mean, I think for this, for the non-soccer people who are watching this, football, soccer or football, soccer, football, soccer ball is the biggest sport in the world. It's the
Yeah.
most broadcast event. It's the most popular sport in the world. They call it the beautiful game. And we're going to anticipate millions of visitors into each of these cities. And it'll be essentially 104 Super Bowl size matches. So think about the
Wow.
city of Seattle, right? Lumen Field. You're hosting at least five Super Bowls within 6 weeks with millions of international visitors. I think Italian fans usually don't go to Super Bowls in US stadiums, but Italian fans, I guarantee you, and fans from South America, from Asia, are going to come over into our host cities to watch soccer.
So in this migration and in and out of these cities, there's
Yeah,
going to be some displacement. There's going to be some chaos, and that's where we come into the
exactly.
question.
And, it's taking place in communities that are already very much entrenched, right? I think it depends on the city. Of course, there's no one size fits all or cookie cutter approach to addressing some of the solutions on the ground, but we certainly anticipate that some of the most at-risk residents are people who are unhoused or unsheltered, people who, include children, people who are at risk of displacement because of ongoing gentrification efforts in their cities, people who are at risk of being over-policed, across a whole host of other issues, right? So as part of the Dignity 2026 Coalition, which I co-lead with some counterparts at the AFL-CIO, we represent a growing list of national, international, and local civil society organizations that work across a range of issues. So inclusive of that is workers' rights, people who are LGBT, part of the LGBT community and face discrimination, right? I'm thinking about past World Cup events like the Qatar World Cup in 2022, where that was a huge issue.
Hmm.
And looking at children, people who are also people who are at risk of, human trafficking, people with accessibility or disability concerns. So it's a range of people that will be impacted. And on the other flip side is host cities are funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into this. So we want to make sure that their residents and taxpayers in these host cities are able to actually reap some benefits for this giant tournament that in the end is going to, I think, provide FIFA around $14 billion in revenue.
Well, that's a lot of money and a lot of attention. I'm sure this people who are watching this who are in those cities are a little bit aware of what's starting, but let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure here. Around these stadiums and in the pedestrian avenues of people coming to and from the stadiums, there's going to be a lot more than average security, and that's going to be there for a while.
Exactly. So I can tell you a little bit what we know, and I can tell you a lot about what we don't know. For folks who don't know, FIFA is controlling the management of everything that goes inside the stadiums. These are all NFL stadiums, by the way, that's hosting the World Cup. And so whether it's kind of the vendors inside a stadium or the workers or the security forces inside the stadium, that is under the purview of FIFA. What the
Okay.
host cities and the local organizing body in host cities are called host city committees, and each of the host cities has one. They're in charge of the fan festivals that will be occurring outside the stadium, where people go
Oh,
to kind of drink and
right.
watch the games from, big screen, monitors and, buy merch and things like that. That will be happening at different places outside the stadium. So, for example, in Atlanta, that's going to be at Centennial Olympic Park. And
Okay.
so, in thinking about the last mile for FIFA, thinking about where people walk to from their place of public transportation to the fan festivals to the stadium, that's a lot of geographic coverage. And so we've been asking questions about FIFA and the host city committees about what is the security perimeter like outside the stadiums? What's the official or unofficial security perimeters? Who's going to be staffing them? Where are you sourcing law enforcement or security personnel for them? Where are they have what's so-called clean zones or dirty zones, which is FIFA jargon, but what does that actually look like in the host cities? And unfortunately, there is no, again, easy answer. One, because
Hmm.
it's going to be different from each city, but it's also the fact that this information is gate kept by FIFA for, I think, security reasons, which is understandable, but also because across a range of issues, FIFA and the host city committees that are organizing this at the host city level have just been less transparent than we would like them to be about their planning operations for the tournament.
So we've had some meetings already, and there was a big webinar a couple of weeks ago hosted by Tahir Duckett of Georgetown and Moki Macias of Atlanta PAD, where we had people from all over the country come, not just mobile crisis workers, but people interested in the welfare of people who might be homeless or people who might be in this last mile and get swept up.
Mhm.
What did you hear in that meeting that was alerted you?
Yeah, I think one of the most compelling, I think the most compelling narratives we had was somebody from I know who I think we shall we shall make remain nameless and in this process, but representing New Orleans and New Orleans' experience of all of this. So she talked about how over a 4-month period last year, there was heightened enforcement downtown near the Superdome for multiple reasons, including the Super Bowl, and also several Taylor Swift concerts, something called the Bayou Classic. And she talked a little bit about the efforts on the ground to be responsive to community members' needs. But really, I think what was really striking was the numbers, right? What I remember was her saying that people who were unhoused had less than an hour to move to some warehouse outside the city, and they were given the choice of either move or you will be arrested. I think I think the crisis teams on the ground documented 20 to 30 sweep events within, a 10-month period in the lead up to that 4-month period. And so I think what that really says to us is that a lot of this is cumulative in cities, right? Like the impact of this as you move people around, like they're, toys in a video game, you're picking up and moving them, not just for one event, but events as they happen over and over again. And we see that in the cities, right? So in LA, they're hosting not only the World Cup, but they're also going to be hosting the Olympics and Super Bowls down the road. Same thing with Atlanta. A lot of the East Coast cities this summer in June are going to be hosting what's called the Club World Cup. And I hope you don't ask me what the Club World Cup is. It's another tournament of international clubs that FIFA is organizing, but that's a different organizational structure. What remains true, however, is that these are still large-scale soccer events happening in these cities, and there's going to be at least 8 cities that are both hosting the Club World Cup this summer, as well as the World Cup next year. And so that's a lot of it's a very resource-intensive sequence of events happening across these cities, and so. From an organizing perspective and maybe a mobile crisis response perspective on the ground is that you don't really get a break, right? I think as one of my favorite football managers said, when you see the light coming down from the end of the tunnel, is that a light or is that just a light from an oncoming train, another train, right? So I think hearing the anecdotal challenges in those cities has been really interesting. And as well as I think having this opportunity, as you mentioned in that webinar and other opportunities to talk across cities to learn from each other best practices and to cross-pollinate those ideas and resources.
So this is a real challenge to not just mobile crisis workers, but the whole social service ecosystem.
Exactly.
Including legal defenders, including, of course, police and fire and EMS, the other 3 branches of public safety.
Aid providers, yeah.
Is there local planning happening in these cities at this point?
Theoretically, yes. Of course, again, and I'm sorry that I keep saying this. I'm sick of my hearing myself saying this, but it depends on the cities.
Yeah.
There's a range of responses. As I mentioned, all cities in theory have what's called a host city committee.
Okay.
That is supposed to be the linchpin for all of this from the city's perspective. On the ground in many of these cities, stakeholders have organized themselves, not just working across, similar disciplines, but also across disciplines. So people working on housing issues, working with people on the labor side, people working on alternative first response, people who work on discrimination issues, uniting as coalitions to knock on the doors of the host city committees together and say, this is our list of demands or concerns, and this is how we can be able to constructively work with you to help you prepare for this tournament that's now around a year away. But we also see that there's a few dynamics happening in cities, which is that in some cases, as you know, community organizations on the ground or mobile services organizations as well are really overburdened, particularly, I think, now, given everything that's going on in 2025, right? That's the elephant in the room. We're very much overburdened, and yet they have to kind of step it up, or they feel like they have to step it up to be able to prepare for 2026. And there's just no capacity for that. And so not everyone's able to be at the table with the cities. Some cities are also playing games, right? Where they are not being as upfront and transparent as they should be, even though technically, in theory, FIFA has asked them to be transparent with the stakeholders, especially because this summer, they are finalizing what's called a human rights action plan in those cities that are supposed to be implementing FIFA's guidance for host cities on how to respect human rights and labor rights across the board. So in theory, that should be with the engagement of local stakeholders on the ground, but we know that's not happening consistently across all cities.
But I think it's important you're saying this to enunciate that you're not an employee of FIFA. You're
Oh,
not professionally associated. You are an advocate on the outside, supporting these organizations to be have a more eloquent, authoritative, credible voice.
no, that's right, Jason. I am definitely not an employee of FIFA, and I am not an employee of any of the host city committees. I work at Georgetown. I consider myself a civil society member. I run a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and we do a lot of, policy advocacy. And so I see myself as in this role as almost kind of a switchboard operator and information
Mm.
broker. So we tend to, what we want to do at the Dignity Coalition is share out our expertise, our experience in working with stakeholders across those different host cities. Share our expertise in consultations with FIFA because we do learn information for FIFA. We've established relationships with them for the past few years with the 2026 team specifically, where we're in constructive dialogue to each other. We tell FIFA what we're hearing from the ground up, from community-based organizations, and we use that as pressure points against FIFA to say that, we understand this is what you're doing, do better. Or where do you need information? Where do you have information gaps? We can connect you with stakeholders on the ground. We're also trying to connect stakeholders across cities. So for example, like the webinar you talked about, like upcoming webinars on child rights, on temporary workers, on legal aid. We are trying to connect stakeholders who work across their discrete issues and silos to learn from each other because we know that what happens in Boston for the World Cup is also going to impact what happens
Yeah.
in Kansas City, right? There's an osmosis effect going on. And then within cities itself, we are also trying to facilitate organizing within some of these cities where the stakeholder organizing has been a little bit less coordinated. And so we're trying to kind of coordinate that response on the ground, deferring to the expertise of the city's stakeholders, because I don't live in Atlanta, I don't live in Houston, I don't live in Dallas. But to the extent that we have our networks from the Dignity Coalition, we can help people start those conversations.
And you have a lot of partners in this work as well. I remember you mentioned the AFL-CIO a moment ago.
Yeah, so I work very closely with Lee Street by the AFL-CIO, who comes from decades of experience in unions and labor organizing. I think we've talked about the fact that I do a hodgepodge of a lot of different things under the umbrella of social determinants of health. But we have a lot of blind spots, right? I am not an expert on a lot of civil rights issues. I'm not an expert on alternative first response, on policing issues. And so that's why we pull in people into our ecosystem, into our orbit, like yourself, Jason, to be the voice at the table that represents these issues and to have the experience and expertise, but also importantly, the networks on the ground, all your affiliates in AMSA in the cities bring them to the table to work with us to brainstorm what it is that we need to ask host cities to do better and what we need to ask FIFA to do better.
So as this is rolling along, how are people going to stay informed about what's going on, and how can they meet other people interested in this subject?
Yeah, so I would say that, for example, if you are a stakeholder in Seattle and this is the first time you're really hearing about this, if there's a way to try to figure out who within your city has become the center of gravity in organizing this, I think that's a place to start. What we've seen happen a lot in cities and across other FIFA tournaments is that they tend to FIFA from the top down, or host cities from the top down, would intentionally or not intentionally pit stakeholders against each other. So unfortunately, what we see is that there are wedges driven between stakeholders. They try to have them cannibalize each other so that their voices kind of cancel each other out. And so what we think is more effective is if stakeholders in the cities are able to come together as a coalition, as a coordinated response to seek that list of demands, or to kind of work with cities to make sure that they're speaking with one voice, because I think that's where the positive legacy is going to come from. Not just the outcomes of what we see from a policy perspective or other metrics out of these games. But we think of this as a massive local organizing opportunity for stakeholders on the ground, particularly if you hadn't had experience working together before. This is one vehicle to do that with because we know there's a lot at stake, and this is going to be on the biggest public stage in the world. And I lost track of the second part of your question.
So if
Oh,
you,
contacts. If you don't know who that linchpin is in your cities, feel free to reach out to us. You can feel free to share my email. And because we have contacts in all the cities, we can share that with you. So that's just the contact part, like who to call, who to talk to.
but
We
better than talking directly to the host committee, say if you run the little mobile team I don't know, at Kansas City, rather than you calling the host committee and representing you, it's better to find other people in Kansas City that are also communicating with this host committee and come to them as a coalition.
come to them as goal, figure out a strategy, right? Figure out a communication strategy, figure out a strategy, whatever your city politics are too, is figure out a way that is going to make sure that your local elected officials are at the table, are invested in this. So I would try to be strategic about this because I think different people knocking on the host city committee's door, number one is they're probably not going to answer all 100 knocks if they get, 100 phone calls. And they'll easily say, well, we just talked to so and so last week and they told us something different. So we're not going to touch this issue. And that's not what we want to see happen, that we have seen that happen from past experience. So I would just say I cannot recommend enough, if there's nothing else to take away from this, is to try to go into this strategically and coordinate it in a coordinated fashion with other stakeholders. And so that you are kind of a push from the ground up and that you're a voice that's, as we say, it's too big to ignore.
And that mobile crisis is an important component in that voice because of what's going to happen. We can anticipate the need for mobile crisis.
Exactly, because I think there's a lot that we can do actually on the ground or in the lead up to the tournaments and maybe after the tournaments when there's kind of a dissection or postmortem of what could have, should have been done differently.
Mhm.
But I think in terms of the actual those 6 weeks and thereabouts, give or take a few days or months, is the alternative mobile services organizations on the ground are going to be the ones who are actually be the eyes and ears of the tournament. And so I think it's so helpful and it's so critical that they're looped into this process early on and part of the conversation, right? I don't think that we can have these conversations in any meaningful or credible way about security and community safety and all those things without AMSA and AMSA's partners at the table, because they're the ones who have experience around doing this for past events. And I know that resourcing is going to be an issue, right? So figuring out what are the low-hanging fruits, how do you not duplicate efforts, and how do you not have to reinvent the wheel? Like, are there know your rights trainings that can be deployed that you can recycle and use across events? Who are your friends at the table who may be able to pick up some of the slack if you have bandwidth issues? So I think all this can be achieved if we're just, we're able to communicate and anticipate some of the responses early on.
And early on, it's already, the planning is well underway for this event that's going to happen in over a year from now.
Yeah, and I can tell you then host cities and with FIFA, they've already planned a lot of this. They say to us too that they're going to figure it out along the way. And they are. They're still planning from the host cities and FIFA are already in motion, even though it's not finalized. I would say that we don't want to be, I think the soccer team is on the back foot of this. We don't want to constantly be playing defense or catch up. I think the best way for us to be best positioned to mitigate a lot of the risks coming out of these mega sporting events and these large tournaments is to be very proactive on this. So that as the city, for example, says we're still developing our plan for human rights, stakeholders can say, actually, that's great, but this is what you can work toward rather than come to us afterward when your plan is already in place.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. Last question. Do you have a prediction on who's going to win it all? Do you follow a particular team?
I do, but my team, I can't believe I get the platform to talk about this. My team is the Tottenham Hotspurs in the Premier League. So they're not a national team.
Premier League.
Premier League. They just had an important win yesterday. But I think if I were to pick a country out of a hat, it would probably be Argentina.
That's a good pick. I always root for Switzerland.
Are they playing the World Cup? Sorry.
Always.
Always, yeah.
Take care, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Lovely to be with you.